When we hear about the Civil War, we think about blood, fighting, and slavery. However, what about the battle that started this war? Don't you ever wonder about the moments that led up to the first battle, the struggle, the planning? Throughout the Civil War, many forts played major key roles in battles, one of them being Fort Sumter, the first battle of the bloodiest war in American history. From Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter. On December 26, 1860, Major Robert Anderson secretly evacuated his army of about 100 men from Fort Moultrie and took off across Charleston Harbor to Fort Sumter. A few days earlier, on December 20th, South Carolina had seceded from the Union, making it very easy for South Carolina's militia to storm the fort by force. This, however, wasn't the only reason as to why the Unions evacuated the fort. Fort Moultrie was built next to a seashore town, where enemy fighters could easily climb second-floor windows of houses and actually fire down at the fort's defenders. Due to all these factors, Major Anderson wanted to move his men to a fort where they would at least have a good chance. Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was built on an artificial island just about a mile out of the shore of Charleston, South Carolina. Construction began on the fort in 1827, but over 30 years later, the fort was still unfinished. The five-sided fortress walls towered approximately 50 feet above the parade grounds. Fort Sumter was designed with 3 levels of gun ports that could hold 135 cannons, 2 levels of arched rooms, and an upper parapet level on the top of the walls. Although the fort was designed to hold all these things, that doesn't mean that they were there when the Unions arrived. When Major Anderson entered the fort with 61 artillerymen, 13 members of the regimental band, 7 officers, and 1 junior surgeon, he was in shock. Out of the 135 cannons the fort could hold, only 15 were present, and 45 guns were placed in berserk angles all around the fort. The biggest guns placed up top were massive Columbiads and 8-inch howitzers. However, no casemates were present to protect the gunners. Due to this, Major Anderson opted to use only the guns on the lower level, where the gunners would be protected. There was one thing for sure. Over the next few months, the Union soldiers were going to have to prep for the battle, preparing for war. The 3 months before the start of the Civil War at Fort Sumter were brutal. Troops were constantly constructing batteries, positioning guns, and making every preparation possible to defend the fort. Some of the guns placed included 6 10-inch mortars, as well as 20 guns consisting of 24, 32, and 42 pounders. Some were very surprised they had time to even prepare the fort. Most thought that once the Confederates realized that there was no one at Fort Moultrie, shots would come towards Fort Sumter. However, none were fired. This gave the Union enough time to replenish its supplies. When the troops arrived at Fort Sumter, they had realized that when they evacuated Fort Moultrie, they left most of their supplies there as well. All they had brought with them was only about a month's supply of hospital stores and around 4 months of provisions for the command. This would always be the Union's weakness, shortages of supplies. For months, up until the beginning of the war, the troops would survive without much food or water. Major Anderson kept lookout for months for Confederate troops, but saw nothing until April 12th, at around 3:30 a.m., when 3 aides sent by General Beauregard of the Confederate Army came rowing across Charleston Harbor to Fort Sumter with a surrender proposal that read,
"By the authority of General Beauregard, commanding forces of the Confederate States, we have the honor to notify you that he will open fire of his batteries on Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time. We have the honor to be very respectfully your obedient servants, James Chestnut, Jr., Captain of Confederate States Army, Aide-de-Camp."
This letter only meant one thing. The bloodiest war in American history would start in 1 hour. The war begins. At exactly 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, the first shot of the Civil War was fired by Captain James of the Confederates. When the shot descended from the Confederates, it could be heard everywhere. Captain Abner Doubleday, a Union officer inside Fort Sumter, later wrote that,
"After sailing high in the air, it came down and buried itself in the ground. Its explosion shook the fort like an earthquake. Union Captain Abner Doubleday."
Residents in Charleston were awoken by the shots and got out of bed to see the battle. One wrote,
When I heard the first shot, I sprang out of bed and on my knees. I prayed as I never prayed before. Mary Chestnut, wife of James Chestnut Jr., Charleston resident.
Inside the fort, defenders were already having trouble with fires set by red-hot cannonballs, but luckily, flames were easily put out. Even though the first shot of the Civil War had been fired, Major Anderson told all troops to hold fire because of the scarce ammunition on Fort Sumter. He also didn't want anyone to fire because he wanted it to be bright enough to see the Confederate targets. At 7:30 a.m., after 50 Confederate cannon shells had been fired at Fort Sumter, Abner Doubleday finally fired the first shot of the Union in the Civil War. However, due to shortages of gunpowder, soldiers only used 6 cannons and fired slowly. During the battle, it seemed one-sided. The Unions had a tiny force of 6 Federal cannons, which seemed a measly amount compared to the Confederates' force of about 10 times as many. It was also extremely hard for the Unions to hit the Confederate batteries that were reinforced with cotton bales and strips of railroad iron. By that Friday evening, the fort was still in control by the Unions. That evening, almost all of Fort Sumter's buildings were aflame and starting to go out of control. That night, the defenders had trouble sleeping because on Saturday, April 13th, the Union flag was still above Fort Sumter as a fire was blazing out of control, threatening Fort Sumter's main power magazine. It was clear to both sides that this battle would not last much longer. Surrendering Fort Sumter. With Fort Sumter's gunpowder supply being threatened by the blazing fire and defenders gasping for air, there was no doubt that it was time to surrender. Gunpowder was so low for cannon fire that they could only do 1 round every 10 minutes to keep supplies sturdy. After 34 hours in combat and 4,000 shells fired at Fort Sumter, Major Anderson took one look at the burning fort and agreed to the new surrender agreement from the Confederates. The Confederates then sent over men to help put out the horrendous flames. On Sunday, April 14th, the Union flag was officially taken down at Fort Sumter and replaced with the Confederate flag. During the 100-gun salute that day requested by Major Anderson, a spark dropped onto a supply of gunpowder, creating man in the Civil War, Private Daniel Huff. Over the course of the battle that lasted 34 hours, no one was seriously injured or killed, making the Battle of Fort Sumter the only battle in the Civil War that did not have any fatalities. At the end of that April 14th, no matter the differences between the two groups, the Confederates slew the Unions as they sailed off of Fort Sumter for their tremendous bravery. Fort Sumter today. Today, Fort Sumter is known as a national monument in Charleston Bay, South Carolina. There, you can find firearms from the original battle and documents from the time era. Fort Sumter is important to the Civil War because without the battle, the war would have taken longer to start. The Battle of Fort Sumter will always be known as the day that the Union took a stand for slavery against the Confederates. The day when the Union finally let it be known that we would do all we can to make things right.